Hi everyone, my name is Dag Sonstebo. I'm a cloud architect with ShapeBlue. Been with ShapeBlue for 3 or 4 years now, I think. Worked with CloudStack since about 2010, 2011, back in cloud.com days. I think I know some of you, most of you. Work with various CloudStack projects on the consultancy side at ShapeBlue. I'm going to skip all the blurb because you'll have seen it a few times before. So there's going to be talk on the CloudStack User Service. So just to kick off, show of hands, who uses it in anger at this point in time? That's a lot less than I expected. So CloudStack User Service, we'll go through it in a bit more detail, see how it's set up, how it's configured, how we can use it, how we can query it, how you can get useful data out of it. And I know from speaking to, for example, Christian earlier, that is something that is useful to a lot of companies that want to do billing, reporting, etc. on CloudStack resource usage. So CloudStack User Service, in its most simplistic form, it looks at how we utilize resources in CloudStack on a per account basis. And it splits that up into time slots that ultimately you as an end user can assign a price to, be it for whatever reason you want to. And that's then data that we can query directly in the database. We can query it through the CloudStack API, or we can tie it into our more, for those of you who have enterprise billing systems, reporting systems, you can tie it directly into that by building your own queries, etc. So we're going to go through a bit more about how we can report on it in a few slides' time. So first of all, I'm just going to briefly cover how you install it. You might have done this already. It's very straightforward. It is a complementary service to the CloudStack management service that you already have installed in your systems, and is as simple as a yum or apt install of the service on top of your management service, or a different service if you so wish. Now, the way it works is it actually ties into your DB properties files, your key files, and so on, that is used by management already. So all the authentication details are already in place on your service effectively. So the CloudStack User Service knows how to speak to your CloudStack management database. Just touch on some of the global settings that we have. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail here, just the two main ones that have to do with timing and reporting aggregation times. So briefly touch, obviously we have Enable User Service here, which effectively just switches the user service on and off on your system. We have a stats exec time, which sets the initial timing of when the CloudStack User Service runs. Now, the way the CloudStack User Service executes jobs is slightly tricky. It's something that might need some improvement in the long run, but ultimately, that's the time your user service kicks off, and it'll then aggregate for every time period that you have set in your user stats job aggregation range. Now, I'll get back to how that's used in the reporting a bit later on. Suffice to say that if we set this to daily, effectively means that it runs the usage jobs once a day. It aggregates, looks at what usage your accounts, your users have used during that time. So, how does this all hang together? First of all, everything that we do in CloudStack generally has event pairs. So when you start a VM or when you build a VM, that's it created. When you destroy it, that's the end of that VM's life cycle. Apart from that, you have lots of pairs like this. You have start stops, you have request releases, and generally these go in the circle depending on what resource you're utilizing at any point in time. Now, the way we do it in CloudStack, we categorize these events in usage types. And Paul briefly mentioned this during his backup and recovery talk. We have something like 20-odd, numbering I skipped a bit at some point, but we have 20-odd usage types at this point in time. The bottom one here is from one of Paul's test environments, which does start taking into account the new backup and recovery framework. But if you look at the top here, it's obvious we start with our running VMs or allocated VMs We have a few for networking, IP address usage, network usage, etc. And move on to storage with volumes, templates, and ISOs, etc. So this is all stuff that can be grouped on a per account and per domain basis in CloudStack. So if we look at how events and information and metadata flows around usage when we have a running CloudStack system, we start looking at what happens on the CloudStack side and what happens at the CloudStack usage side. When we make an API call in CloudStack, and let's face it, everything in CloudStack that we do as an end user is based on an API call. CloudStack management receives that API call, we process it, and we write an event to the cloud usage event table. Now, just a note here, in this talk, I'll jump a bit between the two databases. You'll notice that sometimes talk about the cloud database, sometimes talk about the cloud usage database. Sometimes they actually use the same table name. So just pay attention to what the CloudStack database name is, whether it's the cloud database or the CloudStack usage database. So we now have our events. When the usage job kicks off, as mentioned earlier, it kicks off at this exec time. We first of all copy all our data from the cloud usage, from the CloudStack main database, from the usage event table, over to the same table in the cloud usage database. So in other words, we just take a snapshot of everything that we have in the cloud database over into the usage database. We also copy the account table just for reference, so we know that, hang on, when I do reporting on this, at least I know who's owned which resource at that exact point in time. We then start number crunching this data. We aggregate data in what we call helper tables. I'll get back to that very shortly. And then we start dividing that into these billable blocks that we effectively utilize. So if we now start looking at how these usage events look in our database, and I'll apologize up front, so I've just screen dumped this out of MySQL Workbench because it makes a better job of it than I do in PowerPoint. But if we look at this, we can see here that we have, in this case, a very simple life cycle of a VM. So we have VM, PPVM3 here, and we can see our events are create, start, stop, and destroy. So pretty much your standard life cycle of anything in CloudStack. And we can follow the same thing through if it's an IP address or a volume. Everything will follow this same life cycle, these same life cycle events. So as I mentioned, all this data is then copied into helper tables. Now, helper tables help tracking the lifespan of each one of these pairs of events. So in other words, a start and end date stamp of each usage size. So how long was the VM, when was the VM started, when was the VM stopped, and so on. If we start looking at these tables, sorry, might be running out of battery here. Anyway, so if we start looking at these helper tables, we can, for example, look at a VM instance here for account number 4, which is now summarizing all our VM instances. And we can see here that if we look at, for example, PPVM2 here, we can see these usage types. And if you remember the table I showed you earlier, we had usage type number 1 is running VMs, usage type number 2 is allocated VMs. We can see that this VM in question, it was allocated on the 6th of September. It hasn't been destroyed yet, so it doesn't have an end date. It's been running from the 6th of September through to the 9th of September when I stopped it. And then on the 20th of September, I started it back up again. And it's been running ever since. So this is how helper tables hang together.
So that's like a details table.
Yeah, it's a details table, but it's a means to an end though. Right. It's there purely to track it before we start splitting this into billable units. If you look at a different helper table, in this case for storage, you'll notice we don't have a usage type in this. Simply because it's storage. It's not like a VM that has both the running and allocated state. It's just volume usage, basically. It's just storage usage. So again, we can see our zone IDs, our counts, etc. We can see what the volume was, when it was created, when it was deleted, and what the size was. Again, IP addresses, goes without saying, an IP address is simply allocated to someone and released from someone. So it's back in the free pool. So once we have these usage tables, these helper tables populated, we know when a resource was used from to. We can then start splitting those blocks of time into billable units or reportable units for whatever purpose you want. If it's normal billing, show back, scare back, whatever term that you want to use for your reporting. Now, this is where CloudStack then uses this aggregation time range and says, right, okay, in the period of the aggregation time range, how much usage have I had of each resource? Now, in this case, I've chosen to use this default setting of 1440 minutes, a 24-hour period, during which I'm going to be reporting on. So in other words, I want to see how many hours a VM has been used in any 24-hour period. That's how we aggregate this data. So hopefully everyone can see this, starting to get a bit small here, a little bit loss of detail. But if we look at the data that now ends up in our cloud usage table, we can see, first of all, we have our usage type here. So here we got our running VMs, we have our allocated VMs, we're getting into the volumes, networks, and so on. And as you can see, if we look at everything above the white line here, you can see that first day when I started up these resources, I didn't use that many hours of usage during that day. I started them up in the middle of the day. So this first day, there you go, I only used 10.9 hours in that first 24-hour period. Then we get to the end of the month and we can see, okay, that resource has been running. It's been running 24 hours after the 24 hours aggregation range. So that's where our raw usage comes in. Now, you'll see that raw usage isn't always time. It's sometimes also based on the context of the usage type in question. So as you can see here, for network bytes and received, we see that's actually amount of data rather than the number of hours, effectively. Resource ID. A resource ID is, again, in the context of what you're reporting on. If I'm running, in this case, usage ID, user type number 1, is in the context of PPVM1, and that tells me that is VM number 3 and VM number 5. If we look at it from a network point of view, it's going to be referring to a network instead. So is that a question?
Yeah, it might as well be. The user side, do you have an example for a snapshot creation or anything like that?
I don't have it on these slides. I'm going to have to pull it up in the lab afterwards, and we can play with this, because this lab's actually sitting running in the background on my laptop here. But I can show you afterwards, and I'll get to some slides where we start reporting on this, where we start pulling together.
I was wondering how that is tracked in terms of.
It will be, because that's again storage use, and you'll see there's be helper tables specifically for that in the database. But give me a shout afterwards, and we'll have a quick look at it in the lab, and I can show you in a bit more details that specific question. I just don't have it on the slides at this point in time. Volume or snapshot size, there you go, is again depending on if it's a storage-related usage we're tracking or not. And at the end here, we then have start and end date. In other words, those 10 hours, when were they utilized? In this case, we have between the 6th of September at midnight and 23:59 on the same day. So it shows us when that was utilized. If we ran this on an hourly basis, obviously that would be running much more frequently or aggregating much more frequently. What we also have here is, you see here description and usage display. So if you ever look for the nice plain English explanation of what you're actually utilizing, that's where to look for that information. We can also query the usage data through the API, through an API called list usage records. And as you can see here, in this case, I've just used CloudMonkey. I've just pulled that back in a JSON format. So you can use that to parse that however you want, using JQ, for example, in this case. You can output it in all the standard CloudMonkey formats, tables, etc. However you want to parse it. So, moving on to some reporting examples. I'll start simple, I'll build as we go along here just to see how we can start linking the tables together. Now, if there's any DBAs in the room, feel free to correct me on my SQL queries here. But if we start looking at how we now summarize of this, we see we pull the data out of the usage table here. In this case, we're also going to link to the account table because that's useful information. We want to know who we're billing and reporting this data against. And you'll see here, we're aggregating effectively usage type number 1, which is a running VM, for the account name bbanner for the month of September. So we're saying, right, what bill am I going to send to Bruce Banner at the end of the month of September for all his running VMs? So to do that, we effectively summarize what our raw usage is, and we get our resulting table. We see that Bruce Banner's BBVM1 has been running for 268 hours, BBVM2 for 25 hours, and so on. So that's just for one account and one usage type, which is our running VMs. Sorry about this. Moving on to network utilization. In this case, again, we link our usage tables and our account tables just to get our account ID. Again, we'll look for what network usage we've done in the month of September, where the usage type is in 4 or 5. That was egress or ingress traffic. So we group onto both of them. We can see here that Peter Parker has egress traffic of 22 meg in that month and ingress traffic of 3.8 gig effectively in that month. So that's how we calculate the amount of network bandwidth used by specific accounts. Volumes, again, in this case we choose to start pulling a lot more information. We want to know what volumes we're talking about, we want to know what VM instance that volume is tied to, and so on. Again, we're looking for usage type number 6, which is volume usage for September for the account of Peter Parker. And again, we now start summarizing the number of hours. I've just simplified this by giving you the hours and the disk size separately, so we can just double check our figures. We look at the volume size, we'll look at the number of hours used, and we calculate, in this case, what we call gigabyte hours. And what we end up with is, for the account of Peter Parker, for the instance names, we can then see the usage for each volume. We see the root 3 here, 2 gig ran for 343 hours, gives you effectively 687 gigabyte hours used in that month of September. So there's a question at the back there.
Yeah, so for start, if you're using thin disk, are you going to get the actual use of the provision? And also, can you do for I/O?
I'm not sure if we can do it for I/O. As far as I know, you don't get the thin size, you get the provision size. Obviously, if you're an ISP, you're very grateful for that.
That's what you can decide.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Volumes is the physical, the virtual side.
Yeah. So, we now summarized how many hours each of those gigabytes were used in the month of September. Just finishing off with my last example, where I've just chucked in IP addresses, port forwarding rules, and VPN users, etc., in the same report. And we're just simplifying it using the cloud usage database. We're linking to the accounts table. Again, we're looking at IP addresses, VPN users, and port forwarding rules, which is a 3 usage types in question for September for the account of Bruce Banner. And we can see here we then also pull in the description that we looked at earlier, which now tells us exactly what we're aggregating for. Bruce Banner IP address 10.135.173 was used for 586 hours in the month of September. So all that's really missing in these reports now is you saying, well, hang on, I'm actually going to charge this guy. I'm going to charge him, whatever, 10 pence for each total hours of IP address usage. That's possibly a bit on the expensive side, but that's the only table that's now missing for you to create that billing report that you want to send out to Bruce Banner in this case. Moving on to troubleshooting the user service. So in your cloud usage database, you have a job tracking table called usage job. Now, if you ever need to go and look at this, hopefully you won't, but it's good to know. This will track the PID of the user service on that server. It'll tell you at which point it ran its job, what the start date and the end date of that job was, and is just to double up, is then used the epoch time in milliseconds of these two timestamps to use in its calculation is aggregation of usage data. So that's how you track when a job was ran and which time periods it took into account at that point in time. Now, if your usage service has been offline and you switch it on again, the first thing the user service will do is check, did I run my last job? Did I run, if it's midnight, did I run at midnight, or do I have to, did I miss that job? If it missed it, it'll rerun that one job. If not, if it's earlier than that, we might have to do some tweaks just to get that, to do previous times from that. Just one thing to note, your user stats job aggregation range is defaults to 1 day. You can see here the execution time that the job took. In this case, we're not talking a long time, 1,000 milliseconds. Sorry, 1,000, yeah. So in my lab, this isn't a problem. Now, if that starts exceeding my 24 hours there, you can work it out yourself. You start getting some issues with timing and scheduling of that job. So you might need to look at tweaking your data, possibly do some housekeeping, just to reduce the time your job runs. It's not something I see often, but it's something to be aware of. Your logs, separate logs for the user service, varlog, CloudStack users log, and they're quite verbose. You can read through them and work out all the calculations that are ongoing. Something we see every now and then, I think in fact we have a couple of support tickets in at the moment. I don't think anyone in the room, but basically the question comes in, why am I getting charged for something that I'm no longer using? The support ticket I'm talking about is now sitting in our queue saying a customer is getting charged for a IP address he's released months ago. Now, that means that in our usage events, there's a missing entry. That could be for any reason. Could be environmental, could be a server gone down, could be a network issue when that was ongoing, and so on. So what we generally start looking for when that happens is there something missing? Do we miss a destroy event when there was a create event? Do we miss a stop event when there was a start event? Do we have two start events, for example, and no stop event? At which point the user service obviously doesn't know what to do with that data. So it has to then try to make the best of it, and sometimes it gets it wrong. So what we generally do is we look in our event table and we inject or remove entries there. So if the IP address was released on the 15th of the month, we'll inject a event that says, yeah, on the 15th of September, such and such user released IP address such and such, at which point the user service will now stop billing on that. The user service can't go back and do this historically, so you probably have to set that to today, for example. A couple of other APIs calls in question. We have a remove raw usage records API that can do some housekeeping for you. We can also use the generate usage records API to regenerate usage data at any point in time. Someone asked about the quota service earlier as well. You'll see in the usage database there's a number of quota tables. They are used by the separate quota service that isn't directly linked with the CloudStack usage service itself, but they share the same database effectively. There's just added a couple of links here where you can go and read more about that service and how that hangs together. But yeah, if you look in the cloud usage database, you'll see these quota tables. Just don't worry too much about them being there. And that's me at the end. Any questions?
So we recognize that when you leave the standard settings for the period of the usage server
Yep.
on 24 hours,
Yep.
the VMs which are created and removed inside this time range will not be tracked as a usage record. Is this problem known, or is this normal behavior, or?
That does not sound like normal behavior. No, I would expect you still, I mean, you saw my table earlier, we had 10 hours running in that time, so I would expect it to still track if it was stopped and started in the same day. But same as I mentioned to the gentleman in the corner, let's have a play with it afterwards. It should be a relatively quick job to just create data and fake that data, basically. So a lot of quick play with it, and we can see what gets generated. Which version do you see this problem in?
Since 4.8, I think.
4.8, and you're still seeing it in 4.11?
Yes, I think so.
Still seeing it, right? I'll have a play with it afterwards, and if that's still the case, we'll get a ticket logged for that and get that fixed. Any other questions? Another one?
We also recognize that when you get the usage record of the volumes,
Yep.
there's no volume display or volume name inside the record, and also not the VM it was attached at this point in time.
Okay.
Are there plans to extend these usage records? So
I don't think there's concrete plans, but if you find issues, then yeah, please log a ticket for it. And you know, it's
already, but there was no update.
there was no update.
We saw running into the same problem because
Okay.
we want to map the volume to the VM for our customers so that they have the VM price.
Yeah.
And we do a list volumes API call.
Yeah.
We save this query and then we map it.
We also do it now, but if you
Yeah, you cannot redo the job, right? Then maybe you're missing when the volume has been deleted, then the name is missing. Yes.
Also keep in mind that volume doesn't necessarily have to be attached to VM, at which point you saw in my query earlier, you saw there were some volumes that didn't have a VM name attached to them.
And it can just be empty. That would be a better practice as
Yeah.
far as our experience.
Yeah. So, but yeah, again, let's take a look at it. Let's get it logged if it's not already there, and yeah, let's get that sorted.
Just you just mentioned the housekeeping
Yep.
for a few seconds. This is really important because when we did it the first time, I think 2 years after starting the usage record, and our database was so slow because of all the data.
Yeah.
So the API calls just took over 1 hour to get all the pages out of it. So
yeah, can imagine.
Do the housekeeping. Remove entries you're not using anymore.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's something I see that people come to, especially during upgrade time when they come with a 80 or 100 gig database, and you go, hang on, what do we do with this? How do we handle this? It just becomes quite difficult, and you realize that yes, do some housekeeping and reduce that down to a reasonable amount of data, and suddenly your life becomes a lot easier. Yeah, keep in mind that
The network table is also like
there's certain things you you say again.
The deletion, removal, API call only deletes it from one table.
Yeah.
Or delete it from any of the others. So
Yeah, there's certain safety mechanism there, because ultimately you don't want to lose your start tags of anything. There's nothing to say that there's no assumption where you say, right, if I can't find a start tag, but I can find an end tag of something, then I'm going to make the assumption that was 1st of January 2018. There's no such mechanism in there. So yes, you have to be a little bit careful how that all gets reported on. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. This talk is based on a blog post that I did a little while back. You can find that up on the ShapeBlue website. I think there's quite a bit more detail there if you want to go and have a read through that. And I've just added the references for the CloudStack user service on the Apache site as well. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.